Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this special event on writing during the COVID-19 crisis. We have a lot to discuss. I'm sorry to say that Mark O'Connell can't join us. He's come down with an illness, and we're sorry not to have him as part of the panel. Fortunately, Mike and Sinead are with us, and I will introduce them more fully in a moment. My name is Daniel Carey, and I'm director of the Moore Institute at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Early on in the crisis, the Moore Institute established a COVID-19 response group, and this is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've held so far, with more to come. There are previous installments that are available on our YouTube channel, and you can access them through our webpage. And I wanted to begin by thanking my colleague David Kelly for helping with the technical side of things for all of these events, and indeed for this evening. I'm delighted to be joined by the writers Sinéad Gleeson and Mike McCormack. Sinéad Gleeson's essays have appeared in Granta, Winter Papers, and Gorse, and they've been broadcast by the BBC and RTE. Her debut essay collection, Constellations, Reflections from Life, appeared with Picador in 2019. It won the Nonfiction Book of the Year at the 2019 Irish Book Awards and was shortlisted for the 2020 Rathbones Folio Prize. Her short stories have appeared in several anthologies, including Being Various and Repeal the Eighth. She has herself edited two major anthologies, The Long Gaze Back and The Glass Shore. And in October this year, an anthology that she has edited, The Art of Glimpse, 100 Irish Short Stories, will appear with Head of Zeus Press. Sinead is currently working on a novel. Mike McCormack is the author of two collections of short stories, Getting It in the Head and Forensic Songs, and three novels, Crowe's Requiem, Notes from a Coma and Solar Bones. In 1996, he was awarded the Rooney Prize for Literature, and Getting It in the Head was chosen as the New York Times Notable Book of the Year. In 2006, Notes from a Coma was shortlisted for the Irish Book of the Year Award. In 2016, Solar Bones was awarded the Goldsmiths Prize and the Bord Gáis Energy Irish Novel of the Year and Book of the Year. It was also longlisted for the 2017 Man Booker Prize. And in 2018, it was awarded the International Dublin Literary Award. Mike teaches creative writing at NUI Galway, where he's a colleague of mine in the School of English and Creative Arts, and he is a member of ASDANA. So thank you both for being here this evening. Just a quick word for attendees before we kick things off. On Zoom, there's a Q&A button, and we welcome your questions. There's also a chat function, and I'll do my best to take stock of things as we go. And finally, there's a button to raise your hand if you want to ask a question live, and David Kelly can assist in making your mic open. So, onwards with our discussion. Mike, I thought I would begin with you and ask a question about temporality. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what this is like as a time. Is this a time marked off from other time? Will it remain a time marked off from other times?
Hi, Dan. Hello, Sinead. Good to see you. Yeah, this is an extraordinary time. It is time out of the ordinary. It's a time when all the rhythms by which we normally measure our life have been suspended for one reason or another. All the schedules, all the schedules, all the recurrences, all our daily habits, all our rituals, they've all been locked down, closed down, shut down. Even our churches have been closed down, incredibly. And so therefore we find ourselves in a place where the normal markers by which we live our lives have been suspended and set aside in that. And that gives our days a kind of a grey levelness, a grey sameness from day to day. And it's now become the case, I don't know if it's become the case with you, Sinead, but it's now become the case with me, where I can hardly tell one day from the other. And I hardly wake up wondering, is today Sunday? Is this Tuesday? Is it Monday or something like this? And then you throw into the mix, a recurrence or an occurrence like a bank holiday. And you think, Jesus, what does that mean? What does that mean? But mainly, it really brings home to us, I think, the way by which how ordered by work our lives is. And now that our work has been disrupted and we've had to rejig it in certain ways, that we find the rhythms by which we ongo have just been so disrupted. Now, one of the things that I find myself kind of measuring time by is the appearance by Tony Holohan at about 5 or 6 o'clock during the day. It's an awful thing to say, but he's kind of like one of this marker day by day that ticks along now, and you have this daily appointment with him, and he reads out these gradually rising figures day by day by day, and it's like you're part of a national Geiger counter or something like that. And how long on will that go? I don't know. I think that's one way of looking at it, that it is a suspended time or a time out of the ordinary. It might be, in some other instance, it might be worth thinking that it's not a time at all. It's a portal, it's a correction, it's some other thing entirely. There's definitely an onus on us in this moment to think and have an idea about what it is. But I think that any idea we have at the moment is going to be provisional about it. But it's definitely on us to be vigilant and thoughtful about what it is.
Has that been your experience, Sinead, of this kind of time marked out from other times?
Very much so. I'm also struggling to remember what the days are, and all of those, as you say, those sort of routines and markers. And there's an awful lot of talk about capitalism and capitalist time at the moment, and that idea that everything there, that sort of task-oriented time that going back to the 1900s or 19th century, and factories and machinery starting at the same time, so workers had to be there at a certain time, whereas before that it might have been task related. There'd be a harvest, or there'd be lambing season, or there'd be something there'd be reasons for people to work particularly time. So they worked for a time until something was done, as opposed to now what we used to have was a 9-to-5 culture. And I think we all know and have accepted rather sort of meekly, I think, that 9-to-5 culture doesn't really exist anymore, and that all of us are working all the time. We're working at 11 o'clock at night. We work on Saturdays and Sundays without giving it a moment's thought. And part of that is also because we live in a hustle culture. A lot of us don't have the secure jobs, including writers, artists, actors, but lots of other people, shop workers, people who work in cafes and restaurants. We don't have security, we don't have holiday time, we don't have pensions, we don't have often the commitment of a full-time job. It's it's yellow sheets, it's weekly contracts, it's all of those things, and that kind of culture has turned us into it's a hamster wheel culture, and I think it's been very bad for all of us for loads of reasons. We've lost touch with people. We've not made any time for hobbies. We've not made time for writing or painting. And you've seen this in the current climate of people baking bread and doing yoga and, catching up online with people they haven't spoken to, doing Zoom drinks, all of this kind of stuff. And I think for a long time we lost sight of our priorities and what it was that was good for us, and, what that kind of working culture was doing to us, and what made us happy. And I think, and again, I don't think this is any kind of utopian pause for any kind of moment, but I do think it's making a lot of us reassess what we spend our time on, who we spend our time with, and what we actually want to get out of life. And I'm thinking about that in terms of how much I've worked and what I've spent my time and attention on, and I've definitely been rethinking some things for sure.
And are you inclined to think that this is a time which will be transformational? I think that's one of the things that people have been searching for, is some feeling that in relation to climate change, for example, that we might now be able to imagine a crisis that had hitherto remained somewhat abstract, and to see it really as something which will not merely be marked out as, do you remember when, but as something maybe that's in tune with what you were saying, Mike, about a portal, something that takes us to another place or another space.
I think that at the age of 54, I think I've lived through two revolutions, through two paradigm changes, and one was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the other one was the economic collapse of 2008. And I think I might be living in the third one now, whereas we could see this as, I think we could see it as a revolution. It doesn't have the hallmarks of what we consider to be a traditional revolution, of crowds in the street, gunfire. It doesn't have that dangerous chaos. This is more quieter and low level. But I think actually that it will meet the definition of a revolution, which, if I remember it from my Leaving Cert history, was sudden, radical and lasting change. and that. And I would hope that it does. I would hope we'd be able to look back and see this as the beginning of something new. I think one of the things that so frustrated me about 2008 was that we didn't do anything new with it. It was an opportunity to do something new. It was an opportunity to put new ideas in place, new ideas about how we govern, new ideas about how we relate to each other, new ideas about the environment. But we didn't. Really, what we did was we had those boom years in which we spent loads of money, and then we thought that the answer to that was to spend no money. We borrowed loads of money and spent it. So now we were going to usher in austerity and that. So instead of a new idea, we just flipped the thing on its head, and we had boom, and then we thought that the answer to boom was austerity and that. I would hope that this moment, this long extended moment that we're going through in that, this pause, this time out of the ordinary, this extraordinary time, I would hope that we would possibly see it as a time to rethink, as Sinead has pointed out, to rethink, to renew, to reinvigorate. It'd be great to see. It would be great to see even some things. We've seen the heroes of this moment. The heroes of this moment are what we would have seen as the small people of the economy. They were those people who take away our rubbish, the people who are at checkouts, the nurses and people like that down at the bottom of the economy. It'd be great to see those people having their work, their value reprioritized. It would be shocking to think that when this is over, that a crowd of hedge fund guardians is going to come in and sweep it all up and walk away with it and that. Mm-hmm. And I think there might be a chance of that. I think we need to be vigilant, and I think we need to be careful about it. But it would be great to think that a new idea, a new direction, so that we weren't disappointed in the way we were after 2008.
I think it's a great question. And one of the issues, of course, is how we're going to move out of this psychologically when some aspects of the old normality return. Is there going to be a profound sense of disappointment that we return to ordinary life and that we maybe have not captured these energies? Difficult, I think, for children as well. So what's your sense, Sinead, about the process of coming out of the moment? Do you have any kind of prognostication?
Well, I agree with Mike in that I think there's potentially loads of opportunity for change and for that sense of reset that people are talking about. At the same time, I mean, austerity has also just been mentioned, and I think that the austerity that we are going to face into after this is going to be on a whole level that we didn't even that we thought was minor if you think about it in 2008, and that's going to be something that's very worrying, because on top of all the anxiety and fear and uncertainty that people are already coping with, the idea that we don't know how long it's going to go on, and we don't really know the financial and health and repercussions on various levels down the road. In terms of children, one of my children is finishing primary school and is not going to go back, and that's a very kind of rite of passage sort of time to finish primary before you go to secondary, and is quite upset about that. And I think the novelty for a lot of kids of being off school for ages was like, this is great, and now it's like, I miss my friends. And children are, sociability is huge for kids. If they have siblings, that's one thing. It's also somebody to, you can hang out with them, then you can be killing them the next minute. But I think that they're really missing out on that, and it's hard for them to understand. I mean, and to the point where we're watching so much news. I'm trying to restrain myself from watching so much news, and even around them, they know all about it. They're very clued in, but they don't comprehend what it is. And even trying to talk to them from a point of view like, this is a moment in history. You are living through something historical. That doesn't mean that much to them when they can't go out on their bikes and see their pals and all that kind of stuff. But I think it'd be something that, because I don't recall living through anything like this, and it is that sense that none of us have. There's all those kind of conversations around, which we just heard last week about, their hairdressers open this time and this will be opening in August, and yet it's like, even if the conversation about the pubs today, which sounded completely ludicrous to me, and then I don't feel I want to go into a very crowded place for a very long time, or get on a plane, or do any of those things, because there's all this stuff about second waves and about antibodies and about working cures, which there's been some tests done and there's lots of side effects, and everyone talks about 12 to 18 months. So the time frame, I think, is the most daunting part of it for a lot of people. The idea that, you know, we can put up with this for a while, and you can already see this with the numbers. I noticed in Dublin, especially over this weekend, there's a lot more traffic, more people around, and I think there's only a certain amount of time you can keep people on a collective lead, and they'll go, you know, they understand why they're doing it, a lot of people, but then there will still be people who'll go out and have barbecues with multiple people and do all that. And you can't coerce people. You can only appeal to their humanity and their sense in a way. But yeah, it's the longevity of it and the uncertainty of it that I think are what are really getting into people's heads, including kids, I think.
And there's been that interesting DIAS project of measuring seismic activity as one of the most unusual measures, I think, of how we monitor our lives as social beings.
Yeah, I just saw today that I was when I was coming on to do this this conversation with Sinead and I was thinking about how do we move out of this? How do we, you know, what prompts do we take? What guidance do we take, and everything like that? And Sinead and myself have mentioned the dreaded word austerity, and that it would be shocking to think that we would revert back to that, and we should resist it tooth and nail. But there is I think there is a kind of a template there for moving out of it. And back at Davos in 2019. The Premier, the New Zealand Premier, Jacinda Ardern, she posited this idea of a politics of well-being, and that I'm sure it must have sounded really odd at Davos, where you have these you know, red in tooth and claw capitalists and that. But she spoke about kindness, and she spoke unashamedly and unembarrassedly about kindness and empathy and well-being. And she spoke from a country that has an unemployment rate of 3% and a growth rate of 4%, something like that. So to look in, they're doing well. But she said, we're not well. She said there is a housing crisis here. There is a mental health crisis across the country. We have shocking suicide rates. We're not doing well. Obviously, the figures and looking at society as purely an economy, it doesn't help on that, or it doesn't give a complete picture. And so maybe maybe we will find a political lexicon and a political imaginary where kindness and empathy and well-being will have real clout, will have real presence. And it would be good to think so.
Yeah. One of the curiosities, of course, is that need for searching not just for leadership, but also of reimagining our moral capacities. I think is one of the features of this moment. Maybe rediscovering that we actually want that after all.
Yeah.
I might come in the direction of some questions that are a little bit more about your work as writers. And Sinead, if I could ask you, and this is a question that came to me by email. Someone was asking about the motivation to write, and how differently that experience might be manifesting itself at this moment. Do you find, Sinead, as a writer, that you have that motivation? Is it the same? Is the day been so radically restructured that it doesn't allow for that?
Yeah, it's a combination of all of those things, and because there was a lot of structure in my life, so I knew when I had time to write and when I didn't, and what time of the day. And I mean, I wrote Constellations by getting up a lot of mornings at 5 a.m. because that was the only time I could fit it around the rest of my life. At the moment, I find my concentration is really appalling, whatever, but for writing, even for reading. And I have to read at the moment. I'm judging a book prize. I have 10 novels I have to read. And I'm glad of the deadline, and I'm glad because it is making me engage with it, but I'm even reading in a different way. I find that there's kind of a low hum of anxiety going on collectively in all of our worlds at the moment, where you're sort of, it's not even just worry, you're just kind of, it's a hypervigilance. You're paying attention to everything. You're thinking about lots of people and worrying about people. And I find that doesn't lend itself, that anxiety and a lack of solitude in a house where there's other people living all the time doesn't lend itself to writing. Now that could be just a brilliant excuse on my behalf, and I've made many excuses for not writing in the past. But it doesn't feel like that time at the moment. Weirdly, I mean, I was asked to write a small piece for RTE. I was asked to write a piece do a radio thing with my husband, who's a composer, which was based on the theme of distance. And when given a deadline and a small word count, I found I was able to do it. And I think there's an awful lot of people talking about, oh, there will be a pandemic novel and coronavirus writing and stuff. And in one ways, it's been done well in a couple. Like, I look at the Abbey Theatre last week, what they managed to pull off over 4 nights, which were pieces all written, 50 performers, 50 writers, and were given literally like their own laptops and the space of their own homes to do monologues or create some sort of play. And that to me was a really good example of immediate reactive work based on what's going on. At the same time, I look at my own essay collection, which is parts of it are about things that were traumatic and big in my life. I didn't write them for 20 or 30 years, So sometimes there is a time for being reactive in your writing, and there is a time for, I think, reflection and contemplation. It's okay not to be working at the moment, because all writers will tell you they're always working even when they're not. They're thinking, their subconscious is churning away in the background, they're making notes. So I am making scraps and bits and pieces. I'm meant to be working on a novel, and my plan is to get back to it next week, because I've been doing a lot of work, but which I will. But it's different. It does feel very different. And again, I think the pressure on all of us, no matter what your line of work, writing or otherwise, all of us are putting a lot of pressure on ourselves to be productive and to keep the hustle going and to keep doing things and to start new hobbies and learn languages. And I just think if you're getting through the day and you've achieved something at the end of it, whether that's just keeping your head above water, I think that's fine at the moment. You do what you got to do, and if you can write, great. So when the days I can't write, I'm not beating myself up.
How are you, Mike? How are you finding the motivation question?
I was working on a novel. I still am working on the same novel when this whole lockdown started and that. And just very loosely, it was about a man whose world comes apart. And buried in that novel, there was an idea and a consideration of not just a man's world coming apart, but how do you put it back together? And that has become that has bulked bigger as a theme in the book as this last 6 or 7 weeks has gone on. It seems to have shouldered its way onto the stage and become kind of the central preoccupation of my work over the last 5 or 6 weeks and that, and that surprises me. And it's a bit of a relief actually, because I was spinning my wheels a little bit on that, but it seems to have given it a bit more life. And that, having said that, now that's this is a book I've been working on for a long time, and it's like all my books, it's a short one, but it does. I'm very interested the way it has kind of pivoted slightly thematically, slightly under my hand. And the story hasn't changed. The story hasn't changed. The beginning, middle, or end hasn't changed. The whole spinal run of the book, that hasn't changed. But there is now this larger consideration within it is how do you put the world back together again? And that surprises me, I have to say. But I take Sinead's point as well, that I think that there's a pressure on us now to start picking up new skills, and whether it's learning to play chess or learning that language that we never learned, or to pick up that instrument that had been lying there in the corner of the room for months and we never got around to doing it. You can feel a lot of that, all right. And no, I haven't got around to doing any of those things. I have to say, I wish I had, and I think I might regret it, but I haven't got around to it. No.
I think it would be interesting to see, because obviously Mike has been working on this book for a long time, and the novel that I have, I had started before I wrote Constellations, and I have gone back to it in the last few weeks. It's set, and it has always been set in an extremely remote place, and I'm finding the kind of confinement of home is sort of helping me a lot with that kind of setting. But it'll be interesting to see how many people's work, by a process of osmosis, even though they have no intent, they're not writing a pandemic novel, they're not writing about viruses or separation or isolation, but how much of the future work that comes out, whether that's nonfiction or fiction, will by osmosis absorb some elements of the experience that we're having, because so much of our work, fiction or nonfiction, ends up reflecting our world, inner or outer, or our circumstances. There's always elements. It might just be a line, it might be a character, it might be something. So I wonder how many writers are resisting hard the virus seeping onto their own pages at the moment. I think that'll be interesting to see.
I think that's a good point, because I think there's some sort of grey element in the atmosphere at the moment, and it's bound to seep into the ink in your pen, and it's bound to make its evil presence known in our work. And I wonder too how that will rise up and affect our work and everything like that. Who knows? It might lead to, you know, it might lead to some sort of sweetness and light. I mean, I think that one of the things I was thinking about is apocalyptic art and post-apocalyptic art and everything like that coming in here. And you know, I have a few years on you, Sinead, but you know that from our generation, the great post-apocalyptic texts were Mad Max, Blade Runner, Ridley Walker, more recently The Road, and all that kind of thing. And the world, in all of those books, the world kind of disintegrated into a feral tribalism, and there was a wholesale breakdown of human constructs and that. But I listened to a wonderful interview yesterday by a nurse and she was a nurse in Beaumont or somewhere, and she's right at the cutting edge of this thing. And she was saying that she said, and she used a wonderful phrase. She says, in all my years of practicing medicine, I see more kindness and grace and understanding in my trade, in my work on that. And I was struck by the use of the word kindness and understanding, that we know those, but it was the middle one, grace. That was the one that struck me. That and grace is kindly divine. Grace, to my understanding, is divinely ordained. It is underwrote in the heavens and that. And she used it so beautifully. But I sometimes, maybe an art form would come out of this moment in which we would celebrate, explore, thematically, investigate ideas of grace and kindness and understanding, and maybe not take for granted the notion that the world is going to collapse into a kind of a feral tribalism where we're all kind of disintegrate into Mad Max tribes or Cormac McCarthyisms or something like that. Maybe an art of grace and kindness, and that would be a consideration.
It's a very interesting question about directions that might be taken. And I think one of the issues, of course, is that I think Sinead was saying that meaning making tends to be retrospective. So that's also a question for us, is how long is it going to take to engage in those processes of figuring out what happened and assigning some narrative dimension to it.
I think that's an important point, Dan, because at some stage in the future, the country should sit down and say, what the hell happened there? And they should bring together economists and psychologists and religious leaders and painters and poets and novelists and come up with some sort of a combined and coherent telling of what the hell happened. Because my worry would be that the telling of this moment would belong exclusively to politicians or economists or crowd psychologists or sociologists or something like that, and that there wouldn't be a place in it there would be no voices of artists, for poets, for singer-songwriters, for people like that who have done a whole lot of valuable work in kind of helping each other along. Sinead, you tune in to any social media platform, and you see artists reading poems, and you see singer-songwriters giving concerts from their bedrooms or their kitchens or something like that. And artists have stepped up to this. But I would worry that when this is spoken about in the end, that art and artists, what they did, what they think, and what they made of this moment might be lost in that. And there will be no coherent telling of this moment. There will be no complete or coherent telling of this moment if art and artists are not considered.
Very much in favor of that. And I think that there is naturally a tendency to talk about the first response and the most immediate and urgent issues that face us in terms of public health. At the same time, I think this is, as Nessa Cronin has said, a kind of all society problem, and therefore needs an all society approach. And we have to unleash all of those different kinds of energies, some of which are creative, and the ability to analyze situations and to be attentive to them, I think, is one of the particular skills that writers have.
Yeah.
Would you welcome that too, Sinead? That kind of.
I think as well, there was a lot of criticism of how the government responded to how they would help and fund and assist artists financially, and as people have pointed out multiple times, people are at home now, so they're watching normal people on TV. Somebody wrote that. They're reading books. They're listening to music. They're reading poetry. All of those things that are providing escapism and comfort come from art and come from people creating things. So if you want to have that work and those sources of comfort, you do have to support, encourage, fund art and artists. And it's not as simple, as I've said a couple of times before, as sending out a press release when one of our directors gets nominated for an Oscar. You have to fund from the ground all the way up. And it has to be on an ongoing basis. If you want to have this kind of work to nurture and nourish you in the future, when things like this happen, you have to support artists. And I think that's really important to say.
I'm glad you've raised that point. And in fact, it came in a question from Nessa Cronin, but also earlier from Anne Ryan, both of whom were asking about how art and creativity can be supported by the state. Is there scope for that? And both had mentioned universal basic income as a kind of principle. So I wondered if we could pivot to that question for a moment to think about the role of the state here and of how we make sure that we find ways to sustain this activity, which might otherwise be eradicated through the sheer precarity of it under normal circumstances.
Yeah. Without state support, without state support, there is no art. It would be nice to think that we lived in a world in which artists were self-sustaining, but there's never been a period in the history of the world in which artists were able to sustain themselves in that. So I think it's important that they step up, and it's important that they step up. It's important that they put their that the government puts its hand in its pocket to allocate funds, to loose up funds, and to be imaginative in how they disperse it. But I think it's also important for us that we step up and make our case. I hear today, we talked today, Sinead, you were talking there about how you saw publicans making a case to the government and that. And I heard the golfing community make a case on that. We shouldn't have to, but we do have to make a case, and it's such an essential part of this nation's well-being, and it's such an essential part of our presence and the way we project ourselves, even abroad. I heard today Daniel Mulhall in America tackling Donald Trump. It's probably one of the first things you can rely on in the morning in America is Daniel Mulhall tweeting a poem by an Irish poet. It's as regular as clockwork, and it's part of our diplomatic presence abroad. It's part of our soft power. It's part of the way we project ourselves in that. And the government want this. The political class want this, but they don't want to pay for it. And they have this notion of artists being young curly-headed young men and women who are single and who are, in woolen gansies and Doc Martens and who don't have any bothers at all. And when the proper picture of an artist is this middle-aged and worried about paying the rent and probably beginning to look at health issues and that. And we need. It's the most obvious thing in the world. But if you're going to have a healthy society, if you're going to have a complete society, and if you're going to have a society that talks intelligently to itself and that critiques itself intelligently, you're going to have to put money into the arts and that. And they haven't done so. Maybe it's partly our fault that we're not making the case, but Christ, we seem to have to be making it again and again and again and again. And we'll probably have to do it again.
Particularly, I think, as well for actors and musicians, because those kind of public spaces, I think, won't be open for a very long time. So anybody who's relying on, plays in the Gate or the Abbey or, anywhere, or Town Hall Theatre in Galway, whatever it is, anybody who's relying on that kind of work, there is the case to be made for writers can quietly, if they can focus time, aren't worried about money, aren't caring for children all the time, can try to work at something at home. It's not the case for people who need to tour. It's not the case for people who are live performers and playwrights. And they're the people who I think who are really, I'd be very concerned, and have lots of friends who do either or both of those things. And that's going to be very concerning that when the awards are coming out and it's something you can talk about, and the thing we can big up abroad about our country, about the quality of our artists and the work that we produce and the prizes we all win and all of those things. If they're not able to live, eat, pay rent, that work is going to decline, and it won't be there. And it can't be art can't be just for the elite and the people who can afford to make the work. It has to be for everybody. So it should be funded on a proper level. So it's not just people who can afford to be artists on any medium are artists.
I think that's a good point about the performers and musicians, Sinead, because during this lockdown, they're the people, I think, who have been so generous with their time and their gifts and their skills, and that they have, you can't, the only social media platform I'm on is Facebook, and every night you're scanning through it and that you see numerous people up playing fiddles and the quality of the work on that. See, Caoimhin O'Rahala, I watched brilliant concert by him, Sharon Shannon, again and again. You're thinking, you're getting this for free. Why should we be getting it for free? We should be paying through the nose for this kind of thing. But these people, these brilliant people have been given of their time and their generosity in that. And yeah, they deserve. And writers, you're right. Writers don't have quite as tough a time as the rest of them in this moment on that. But those people they were cut off at the knees. Those people that make their lives by performance and by group performance and collaborations, they were cut off at the knees on the 12th of March. They just watched their income being washed away in one tidal wave and that. Yeah.
Mm. We've had quite a few questions coming in, so I wanted to turn to some of them. There's a very interesting one from Claire Fallon. She asked, how do you think the valuing of age groups, particularly older people, will emerge from this crisis? Will we value their stories more, or will their stories remain cocooned away forever now? Nicely put. If you have any thoughts about that.
I hear. I think one of the things that this crisis has done is that in some ways it has actually put people into demographic brackets on that. There's old people, and then there's a whole coterie of people in the middle who are able-bodied and that, and who are cocooned at home. And then we have a really troubled little section, Leaving Cert students, whom I think are under terrible duress at the moment. And then right down at the bottom of the scale, we have little kids and infants and things like that. And each of them are deserving of our sympathies in different ways or others. Personally, I think the Leaving Cert students are under terrible pressures at the moment on that. And I honor and respect the older people that I've come across in my life and everything and that. My big hero during this whole thing is my own little boy. He's 6 years old, and he hasn't played with another child since the 12th of March. So the business of childhood has been radically adjusted, maladjusted for him and that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a really important point about cocooning as a cultural thing and as a political thing and as a health thing, and that I wonder, did we get it right? I wonder, has it been managed right? And I wonder, has it been managed right? I wonder, will there be a story to tell about it? We seem to have a horrible density of deaths and fatalities in among our older people, and that particularly in our care homes and everything like that. So yeah, maybe it is time to revalue and rethink our attitude towards them and that. It's because, and you know, this late capitalist thing, we don't need older people. It's easy to lose sight of them. They're not making anything. They're not investing in anything and that. So you know, they're not the heroes of capitalism and that. So it can be easy to look away from them and that.
Sinead, I maybe ask you a perhaps related question, but I mean, you've written so interestingly about illness and of, you know, treatment and so forth. Has that sort of, have you been reflecting on that in this context about the nature of healthcare? There's obviously been quite a bit of storytelling about that, but some of it is preempted by the nature of the crisis itself.
Yeah, very much so. And I've done a few interviews over the last month, and I've been asked a lot about the virus, obviously, because parts of my book deal with illness and bodies and sickness. And one of the things I have been thinking about, you know, I spent a lot of time in hospital, and hospitals are these, there's a piece in the book called Panopticon, and it's about the geography and the psychogeography of hospitals and what they're like. They are these very in places of incarceration in a way. You can't leave if you want to, because you have to stay. The pact is you stay and they'll fix you, you'll get better. And the first line of Constellations is the body is an afterthought. And what I meant by that was, people don't think about their bodies. They don't think about this incredible mass of muscle, this machine that functions without a moment's thought every day. You get up, it carries you around to your work and your family and your life, and you don't think about it till something goes wrong. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately and tragically, are having those first thoughts. They're having their first encounters with doctors, their first overnight stays in hospitals, having difficult conversations with their families, facing up to mortality. That I'm really interested in the book, and exploring the idea of mortality and what a good life is. And to me, a good life is a healthy life. If you have had a life that's been interrupted and disrupted in the way mine has by illness. And I think a lot of people are having those, or haven't thought about their health ever. And this current climate is making them think about reflecting on, okay, I don't have the house, job, car, partner I like, but I've never been sick a day in my life. And that is, to me, something that should be reflected on more, where there should be more gratitude for that. And I think that a lot of people are having those sort of moments. So yeah, I think it's, I mean, hospitals are really frightening places. Being ill is an incredibly isolating experience. And I think a lot of people are going through that for the first time, especially in the current climate. As we know, we're a country of rituals. Funerals are really important. The idea that there's no funerals, that you can't be with someone when they're dying, you can't hold their hand, it's just the most cruel and horrific thing you can think of. And I think I'm thinking a lot about that. People, you know, expelling their last breath with nobody they know near them, and then not having been able to have a celebration of someone's life when we need that. So I think there's also going to be a lot of postponed grief of a certain kind in this country down the road, that people are going to deal with this if they do decide to celebrate someone's life in 6 months or 8 months, that it's going to bring them back to this time that we're all desperate to get away from. Well, many of us are, I think. So yeah, I have been asked about that, and I am thinking about that a lot, for sure.
Certainly, I mean, there's been obviously a lot of use of the war metaphor in responding to the crisis. Probably not so much in Ireland, interestingly, but certainly in other countries. But wars tend to generate memorials, and that probably is a question about how forms of memorialization that might go on, and of that deferred grief that you speak to, or public acknowledgement of loss. Yeah, I want to move on to another question, a rather different inflection from Aisling Donohan, who says, talking about developing a new hobby during lockdown, John Banville's advice to those wondering about trying to write that book they feel they might have in them was, don't, leave it to experts. What do you think? This is really putting you on the spot. I don't know if there's any good answer, you know, that you can give, but.
Well, my very quick answer to that is, a lot of people I know who are not writers, and a musician my husband knows mailed him last week, and his wife is not a musician or a writer, and said they've both started writing. And I think a lot of people have started to pick up pens, or maybe are returning to diaries, or just keeping notebooks, because writing for all of us is a way of making sense of things. With essays particularly, I always say that it's a way of answering a question. It helps me figure out how I feel about a subject, whether that's something really small or something very big and life-changing. And I think that there's a lot to be said for writing at the moment. It is, for some people, I don't personally believe in catharsis, but for some people it works and it does the job. And I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of reflection, that at the end of the day, if your mind is racing, just even jotting down some things and putting a shape to your thoughts, expelling them out of your head so you can go to sleep, which is another problem we're all having. So yeah, I don't think we can ever tell anybody they can't write a book. I certainly wouldn't tell. I don't believe in a hierarchy of who can and can't write books. I think everybody's capable of it, but it's the sticking with it and doing it is the bigger issue.
Yeah, I know what you mean about sticking with it, Sinead. I started a diary. I started a diary on the 12th day of on the 12th of March. I was going to keep a diary of this plague, and I got to the end of March on that before I just ran out of. I just got so bored. I got bored with the same recurring rhythm of it and that, and with the same recurring of nothing at all. And but now I regret it. I think I gave up too easily on it. I'm beginning to think that these times are fascinating in their way. They're fascinating in their featurelessness in some way. They're fascinating in their shallowness. And they're fascinating in the way they have been stripped away of so many of the rhythms by which we live our life. I'm kind of sorry that I didn't persevere with it in that, but well, the fault definitely was mine. The fault was mine, not the time at all. The theme was there for me. I just couldn't properly see it in that. And if knowing what I know now, I would stick with it in that. But it doesn't surprise me that. Doesn't surprise me that people are picking up pens and starting to write. But then again, who are we to argue with John Banville? If John says leave it to the experts, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, I suppose a reminder of Pepys as, you know, the great diarist, of
Yeah.
course, and the Great Plague of London was, of course.
That's exactly what I had in mind. Pepys or Defoe or something like that in the classic tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, some of his entries are more interesting than others. Some of them are just, you know, went out, had a drink, went to bed, and, you know.
But isn't that the brilliance of Pepys? Is that he was a great noticer of those small things and thought them worthy of his attention. And that there's a brilliant insert on he bought a new razor, and just the joy of having a new razor on that, and how it pleased him mightily. I love that. I've always loved that expression. It pleased him mightily, and that. And yeah, I've bought a new razor, and I've marvelled at the worth of a new razor and the beauty of a new razor. Yeah.
I think if another person says to me, "You do know that Shakespeare wrote King Lear in lockdown," I'm going to run screaming into the abyss.
Yeah, I think that's imposing a lot. And Boccaccio, of course, has been mentioned, and Decameron and so forth. I take a little bit more comfort in thinking about writers in relation to Defoe, who writes the Journal of the Plague Year, but not until 1720. Yeah. I mean, he said it in the moment, but it was a long time afterwards. Sinead, I had a question for you, because you're both a writer of fiction and nonfiction. And I mean, do you find yourself drawn to one mode of expression more than the other at this time? Are they, you obviously were talking about writing a novel, so that's kind of an obligation that you have to yourself, but how are you managing that choice, I guess?
I feel, I've often said that the two feel like different parts of my brain. They require different things of a writer, very much so. I don't think of them all as one big melange and it's all the same thing. It really isn't for me. And I approach them differently. But what I have been doing is I've been writing, I wrote this kind of pandemic postcard thing for RTE, which was like, it was kind of written in fragments, and I'm interested in kind of experimental forms and fragments anyway. You can do an awful lot with them. And I just tried to pay attention. So I don't need to write another nonfiction book. That's not what I'm planning to do. But then these fragments and thoughts were sort of coming to me. But so it was making me think about how much I was noticing. And this is, I'm not the first person to say this. You know, we're all talking about birdsong, about the city being quieter. Your awareness of things has just changed. There's something kind of spatial has shifted. But I was thinking about, you know, I've been thinking a lot about time, and I've been writing a bit about that. And I wrote a bit about Teshin Hussein, who's an artist I really admire and love. He's a durational artist, and one of his very famous pieces from the 1970s is he lived in a cage for a year. The following year, he did a piece called Time Clock, where he punched a kind of a factory clock every hour for an hour every day of the year for a whole year. So his projects are 1 year durational pieces, and he says they're all about time and the passage of time, and he doesn't think of them as a passive act of waiting to fill up the year till it goes by and my project's completed. And sometimes, so I'm thinking a bit about that idea of the passage of time and sometimes we're willing it forward as we may be in this current time, and maybe that isn't. Maybe we need to be more present and focus on current time and present time. So I'm thinking a bit about that. But yeah, I find it hard to do two things at once. I can't really bounce from fiction to non-fiction. It tends to be one thing at a time. I wish I could master that. It'd be great.
A question which has come from, been asked by a number of people is about what you're reading at the moment. I might ask Mike first. Sinead, you've already indicated that you have some professional obligations in terms of literary prizes. So we'll ask you about that in a moment. But are you finding it possible to read, Mike? Is that a form of nourishment at the moment? What's your relationship with reading?
And you know, I've read things that are good for me and things that are bad for me. And the one thing I got to pick up two books that for various reasons I had to leave down at one stage or another. One was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, but the other one, the one that really gets me at the moment is The Leopard by Tomasi Lampedusa, and that's a book. I think that's a book for our time. It's a book that's between two times. It tells the story of this Sicilian prince. It tells the story of the Sicilian prince, and he's an unfortunate man who was born between two worlds, a world that hadn't fully died and a world that wasn't fully born. He's the last of the kind of Bourbon kings of Sicily, the Bourbon princes of Sicily, and he's there just to see, just in time toward the end of his life, to see Garibaldi coming in and the new Italy being formed. And this beautiful Baroque novel it's a brilliant meditation on manners, on politics and family and socio-political turbulence, and a man trying to find his place in this particular times. It really is brilliant novel. If I could recommend one novel though, and I was thinking about this, I thought people might ask, the heroes of this present moment are our medics and our medical profession and that. And the best novel I've read in recent years, and you know it's the best when you covet it as your own. The novel I recommend is by a French writer called Mélis de Carangal, and it's called Men the Living. And it tells the story about a young boy called Simon Limbaud. He's a surfer. And he goes out surfing at 6 o'clock in the morning, and on the return from surfing, he dies in a car accident. And the novel then becomes the story of how his heart is taken out of his chest and it's transported across France. And it goes through a bureaucratic and a judicial process, but most of all, a medical process. And the hero of this book is the medical process, the nurses, the practitioners, the bureaucrats who usher this organ across France to its final destination. And it's an incredible celebration of the medical profession, of work. It's a brilliant celebration of surfers. If you've no interest in the rest of the book, the opening 10, 15 pages are brilliant on surfing and that. And Carangal comes from a medical background herself. She comes from a medical caste. Doctrine and doctors go right back for generations in her, and she is a surfer as well. And she writes these books, this novel, Men the Living, and there's these long sentences that come crashing in like breakers. And I think the best, you know, we all have traffic and commerce with medics and with the medical profession, but they don't feature that much in books and in novels. We see them on TV and that. But novelists don't often square up to them, but she does. And Men the Living by Mélis Carangal is the novel of this moment, I think.
Very interesting. And Sinead, probably, you know, between your different obligations, I'm guessing you're finding it difficult to read for pleasure.
Oh, well, I think a lot of writers have that, and I'm sure Mike does as well. If you're reading things for blurbs, you're teaching, you're reviewing things. But what I have been finding at the moment is I think a lot of people go, I must read Middlemarch, I must read a 900-page doorstep, though I am going to read Don Quixote before the end of this if it kills me. And I'm finding that short stuff, because our concentration is so focused and our brains are hopping around. So, I mean, the essay is brilliant for that. The short story is brilliant for that. Poetry, I'm finding, is not just for the brevity, but because of the distillation and the message that you get from something. I've been reading a lot of that. It's been brilliant to go back and read a lot of Ivan Boland after last week. But then today, bizarrely, because I was looking for something else, and then I went back and read this very story by H.P. Lovecraft, who I really writes really strange, brilliant, macabre stuff, even though he's a completely problematic individual on many levels. But he has a short story written in the 1920s called, and there's a film coming out of it, it's called The Color Out of Space. And it's basically about a color that comes from space to planet Earth and causes a virus. Now, a lot of people thought that he'd written it about after the Spanish flu in 1918, but it was a good kind of 10 years after. But it's really interesting. I know we shouldn't be reading pandemic-y kind of stuff, but it's a really interesting kind of story about that. I think there's a film with Nicolas Cage coming out. But yeah, it's been poetry. I've just finished Annie Ernaux, who's a French writer who, again, so many writers are lost to us because they don't get translated enough or quickly enough. She's a French writer in her 80s. She was nominated for the International Man Booker last year, and she writes predominantly nonfiction, quite autobiographical nonfiction, which is completely brilliant. She's a book called The Years, I'd recommend, a book called Happening, and her latest book is a girl's story published by a wonderful press called Fitzcarraldo. And that's another thing I would say is, at the moment, lots of journals, literary journals and small publishers are really relying on people supporting them. So I took out a subscription to Frieze magazine. I took out a subscription to Les Fugitives, who publish a lot of French writers, a very small press again. So maybe consider buying books from a small press or signing up to, Dublin Review, Stingfly, Gorse, one of those kind of journals, as a way of supporting that those future platforms for future writers will only exist if we continue to help support and fund them.
Good point. There's a very specific question for you, Mike, about there are a couple of different translations of Men the Living. I don't know whether you have exercised full attention to the question of the different versions that are there, whether you have a recommendation of one or the other.
Yeah, I don't have the book. And I've read the two of them. One is called, they're both the same book. Well, they're actually radically different books because they're two different translations. But one is called, just get the one, Mend the Living. The alternative is The Heart, which is that's the American edition. But Mend the novel, the version called Mend the Living is done, and it's really interesting. It's done by a Canadian singer-songwriter, and she goes for the music of the book. And she goes for the music and the cadence of the book and that. And it's such an important part of the experience of that book. I think it's a brilliant book. But your person there raises a really good question, because the two different translations of the book, they're nearly two different books. She's right.
We're coming towards the end of our time. I just want to reference a few comments and then maybe come to a final question. Adam Kelly was asking earlier in relation to a point that came up about the possibility of changing things, say, between the moment of 2008 as opposed to today, and looking at who was in charge, the difference between Obama and Gordon Brown as opposed to Trump and Johnson. I fear we do not have time to do justice to the size of that enormous question. Tina Karen Pusser was wondering about the notion of being in this together as a phrase that's been offered generally, and yet there are wide disparities that people are experiencing, very wide disparities of their experience. I was thinking also of the quiet outdoors that people are experiencing, but sometimes the racket inside because everyone is enclosed. My final question was more to you both as parents, actually, and living through this. With children, and you might want to talk about that just as an experience of parenting, or perhaps there's a connection with storytelling and the kinds of stories that you both have younger children. How do you share stories with them at this moment? Yeah,
that's a good question. I'm having a great time with my little boy. We go out. We go out, what we say we go out on our adventures. Our adventures actually consist in just walking through the adjoining estates and doing a circuit and coming back and that. But we do that twice a day, and it's great fun. It's good fun, and I will miss it. I know part of me finds it a pain in the ass as well at the moment and that, but I know I will miss it. And I think I'm awake enough to it to find it a valuable experience at the moment in that. And I'm having a great time with them in that. Stories, believe it or not, back to Homer and the Odyssey. That's what we're reading in this house at the moment, and that starts at the beginning, the Old Testament, and that. So he's, even as we speak, his mum was reading condensed version of the Odyssey to him at upstairs at the moment. So that's our reading at the moment.
Wonderful. Yeah, Sinead, how about for you?
It's funny, it goes back to what I said about time, because it's only, and again, you know, the way you kind of, other people say to you, God, they've really shot up and they're getting really big and all that, and you don't notice that on a day-to-day basis because they're in and out all the time. And at the moment, conversely, they're here all the time, so you don't have the distance and space away from them with school, for example, to notice that. But with my son, you know, in the time that this has happened, like, his voice is broken. He's now taller than me, and he's just become, I can see the man he's going. He started as a boy, and already he's kind of looking more like a man, and it's made me sort of quite emotional. And that all that's happened without having his friends to chat to about it, and maybe he would be talking to them about all this stuff because they're all at the same age and going through the same thing. But yeah, I can see him changing before my kind of eyes. Also, because my children are a bit older than Mike's, I'm having the thing that a lot of parents are having, which is the UN style negotiations over screen time, and television and all that kind of stuff. So, but he makes music a little bit. My she's always drawing. She's a huge reader. She's been making her own notebooks, kind of in a sort of Del Boy-esque manner. But yeah, they've been trying, because there's only so much you can do. That the routines of, you know, watching television all day is great. After a while, it's not so great, you know. Not that they've been doing that, but I think they themselves are sort of figuring out that boredom can be a good thing. Things can come out of boredom, because again, as I say, they're making things, doing things. My son's been started reading Stephen King, which he's really into, so that's good, because it's always a bit more difficult sometimes with boys and books, but the fact that he's reading it all, so yeah, they're doing their best. And I think I'm feeling for a lot of parents. A friend of mine said to me, at the moment, it's people with kids and people without kids, and there's definitely a bit of that. It's more responsibility, but you know, I know people who are living on their own, and I have people around. I have noise and chaos and tactility. It must be very difficult for people who are cocooning on their own without that kind of contact. You know, Zoom calls are not a hug, or, you know, a sort of reassuring tap on the shoulder. So yeah, we're all going through different parts of it, and hopefully it won't be for as long as we all suspect it might be.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for extremely interesting discussion. We've ranged very widely. There's yet more we could discuss, and I apologize for those questions I couldn't take. Just time is against us at this point. You've given us, as I say, a lot to reflect on, and also I think those closing comments very much as sources of hope and nourishment, which are immensely valuable at a time of uncertainty. Thank you again. And just to say that the recording of this session will be available on the Moore Institute site. And so thank you very much, Mike and Sinead.